A simple reflection provides the mind with an image of the world. This image can be true or false. Reflexivity, on the other hand, also entails a reference to oneself. By bending back on itself, the subject becomes the object and contains itself indirectly over a self-image. Reflexivity, as the thinking of thinking, is a central topic of Western philosophy, and so are the logical problems it causes. From very early on, self-referential reflections have been identified as a source of paradoxes, such as the statement, "I know that I know nothing." One way to keep the paradoxes under control is to organize objects on strictly separated levels. The self in a self-referential statement is thereby divided into two parts. However, this leads to other problems for the theory of truth. For instance, we would have to assume that when Jesus says, "I am the truth," there are actually two Jesuses on different levels. One who may or may not be identical to truth, and one who stands on a meta-level and makes this assumption. This meta-level only becomes visible through a reflection of a higher order. The meta-Jesus cannot be identical with the truth, which is an object one level below. Otherwise, he could not make this observation. Or, as Franz Kafka once wrote, "Truth is indivisible, hence it cannot recognize itself. And anyone who wants to recognize the truth has to stand outside of it." This procedure does open the way to a new truth on a meta-level, but only if the self on a meta-level becomes the object of an even higher reflection. The problem that arises from this theory is that the practice of self-reflection is endlessly repeatable and necessarily leaves the truth incomplete. Yet, as the philosopher Friedrich Hegel said, the truth is the whole. But how can we reach the whole? Or, to return to the optical metaphor of reflection, in what sense is the mirror that reflects being itself part of being? The philosophical systems of German idealism that were developed in the 18th and 19th centuries attempted to establish a hierarchy of reflexivity that is able to solve the riddle. In this video, I will try to outline a simplified version of this hierarchy. We start with the unreflective position. It is the position of the so-called primitive mind. At this stage, the mind perceives the world passively and is unable to create a distance between itself and the external world. Dream and reality, subject and object, form and matter, thought and being are not separated. Without this separation, every thought motive is projected into the immediately given outside world. The inner world of the subject has no realm of its own and can only appear if it is projected into the outer world, which is now permeated by an omnipresent animistic force, the mana, and populated by countless spirits. Furthermore, philosophers and anthropologists assumed that the primitive is completely immersed in his community, has no individuality, and is a slave to nature. Without a reflexive distance to the world, the primitive is neither able to conceptualize the self, nor to negate his world and think of other alternatives. On the next level, we have the first truly reflexive position. This position is associated with the so-called high cultures. Philosophers such as Karl Jaspers claimed that these cultures are closely linked to the emergence of the so-called subject-object distinction. The human mind is now able to conceptualize two worlds and distinguish between thought and being. The animistic spirits retreat into a beyond or are dissolved as mere illusions. Furthermore, the fact that the subject can now recognize itself and create an inner world opens up the possibility of individuality. Man liberates himself from the collective identity of his community and ceases to be a slave to nature. The German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller wrote in this respect, "Man, a slave to nature as long as he merely senses it, becomes its legislator as soon as he thinks it. What previously dominated him only as power, now stands before his judging gaze as an object." The natural sciences emerge at this stage, since it is now possible to separate thought from nature and only observe the latter. The humanities, on the other hand, observe the other half. An observation that is increasingly complex since it involves the observation of observers. The philosophy of reflexivity leads to a separation of the sciences into two distinct groups. While the natural sciences can draw on the stability of their objects, they lack reflexivity. However, scholars in the humanities and philosophers get themselves into quite a mess in their reflective position. First, by emphasizing that their objects of study are both objects and subjects, they find it harder to ground their theories in the laws of thought. Second, by focusing on subjectivity, philosophers open the door to an endless repetition of reflection. Each meta-level can itself become the object of an observer on a higher level and thus be even more reflective. The only thing that can never be reflected upon is the actual observer, just as the actual painter can never be in his painting. If a painter wanted to paint himself in his painting, he would also have to paint himself as he is painting the painter who is painting the image, and so on. Even worse, while the first two levels are clearly superior to the respective lower level, each higher level does not seem to improve the reflective position. They are just boring repetitions of the act by which the mind distances itself from its own content. In German idealism, the endless iteration of reflective levels was associated with doubt, confusion, and restlessness. The German philosopher Fichte wrote in 1800, "And do I really think, or do I only think to think? And do I really think to think, or do I only think a thinking of thinking? What can prevent speculation from asking such questions and continuing into infinity? What can I answer it, and where is there a point at which I could put a stop to its questions? I know, however, and must confess to speculation, that it is possible to reflect again on every determination of consciousness and to produce a new consciousness of the first consciousness, that thereby the immediate consciousness is always raised one step higher and the first obscured and made doubtful, and that this latter has no highest step. I know that all skepticism is based on this procedure. Every knowledge presupposes something still higher than its foundation, and this ascent has no end. To simplify, we will just put the infinite regress of further meta-levels on the same reflective level. The third level also reveals that at each reflexive level there is a surplus of reflection that drives thinking forward and prevents it from coming to rest at the current stage. What remains is the last position, the one that is not only one level above the currently observed level, but which encompasses the infinite range of reflexive layers. We finally reach the subject that cannot be objectified. This very last level stops the endless iteration. It is the position that encompasses the infinity of meta-levels and the ability of reflection itself. Here, the identity of being and thinking is final. In the philosophy of reflexivity, it was often called the absolute. It is the solution to the endless reflection into which one enters when one retreats from the immediately given world into the world of the spirit. The absolute finally catches up with the ever-retreating truth of the meta-levels and reveals the whole. The truth is the whole. The whole, however, is merely the essential nature reaching its completeness through the process of its own development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only at the end is what it is in very truth. And just in that consists its nature, which is to be actual, subject, or self-becoming, self-development. It is hard to overlook the fact that the philosophy of reflexivity is also a philosophy of history. In this model, the reflexive layers have successively succeeded each other over time. In its time, historicization was indeed something new for the philosophy of consciousness. The Kantian model, for instance, stood outside of time and space. This original model just showed the composition of consciousness without any historical dimension. In the same way that the fact that geometrical figures consist of triangles does not mean that there were only triangles at the beginning of history, which then evolved into other geometrical figures. Yet German idealism famously historicized the Kantian model of consciousness and introduced the idea that the structure of consciousness itself has undergone fundamental historical changes. These changes are part of the journey of the spirit on its way to self-consciousness. And the shortest path to absolute self-consciousness, the philosopher Friedrich Hegel claimed, leads through all stages of world history. Hegel believed that history had already come to an end during his lifetime, but the idea of future historical changes to the structure of consciousness soon sparked the imaginations of many philosophers and artists. Marxists in particular foretold the emergence of a new society with a new consciousness on a higher historical level. But it did not stop at history. The model was eagerly taken up by developmental psychology, psychoanalysis, and sociology. The philosophical system of German idealism was intended to integrate formal logic as a special case and solve the problems connected to self-reflection, the laws of thought, and the theory of truth. The hierarchy of reflexivity I tried to present here in an oversimplified model is only a tiny part of the system. Among other things, the concept of reflexivity also encompasses actions, feelings, will, faith, and so on. The system of German idealism was overambitious. It attempted to encompass absolutely everything. It flew high and fell hard. In the second part of the 19th century, the system collapsed. Other philosophies took its place, such as Marxism, existentialism, and analytic philosophy. However, the remnants of this once great but also deeply problematic philosophical system remained present in many Western systems of thought in the 20th century. In particular, the differentiation between the first two levels of reflexivity can often be found in 20th century philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and psychoanalysis.